So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the major topics in here. If you look at one of the first articles in here is called the JFK 10-point program. And what I was trying to do in that piece is try to outline the basic things that everybody agrees on in the JFK case and get us all on board. Because one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed it too, is that when you're talking to various people about these assassinations, about things that we should all really agree on, there is endless debate about what I feel are peripheral issues. For example, in the Kennedy case, you get people having these violent arguments about whether the Texans killed Kennedy, or whether the Pentagon killed Kennedy, or whether it had to do with the Federal Reserve because of the silver certificates regarding Kennedy. Whereas what we do know is that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't do it. And so if we're trying to plant an organizing principle, in other words, if we're trying to bring this to the American public in a way that people can understand, what we should be doing is simplifying our message and saying, we know for sure this guy did not do it, which means not only that the government is the probable executor of John F. Kennedy, but that the major media has been lying about it now for almost 50 years. So in that way, they're complicit. And so these are the kinds of things that I think we should be trying to agree on, trying to get principles that we can all go forward with. Because as it stands now, what we have are a lot of factions that argue amongst each other about things that I don't think are terribly important. But they can form, we can all form research groups internally, but when we're presenting to the public, we have to have a united front. And that's kind of the major ideas, and one of the major ideas that I try to get through in everything in this book is this idea of presenting a united idea to the world. Because when we go on TV, like some of our people do, and rant and rave about various topics, it just doesn't look good for anybody in the movement. So a lot of what is actually in the book, in addition to this, is a kind of a rumination, I guess, or a kind of a philosophical dissertation on the nature of history. Because as we know, history, especially the way it's taught in high schools, the way it's taught in universities, does not match up with reality. What we have is essentially a story, a narrative that is being presented to us. The 50s are a kind of golden age as it's presented, and there's this kind of illusion of progress, that we're constantly triumphant, we're making our way through the world, and we make mistakes and we do these things. We invaded Vietnam, that was a bad idea. But there's no connection to any of the real motivating factors. So, the idea of America as an empire and, how governments behave is not part of the standard fare of what you get in either high school or the United States. And I have one example here that I'd like to talk about very quickly. Because one of the themes about my work in general, and in this book in particular, is that everything has an origin story. Everything comes from somewhere. And so when you look at a given institution or a name that's maybe familiar to you, there's almost always some kind of history behind it. There's a story. So here's one example. There was a guy named Dr. Hideo Noguchi. He was a physician in the employ of the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research in 1911. He injected 146 children with syphilis back in 1911. It's an experiment. This same Dr. Noguchi later was instrumental in creating the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Unit in Maryland, which includes Fort Detrick. In 1931, a guy named Cornelius Rhodes of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research gave cancer to a bunch of people in Puerto Rico, 13 of whom died. And he testified that his belief that Puerto Rico should be wiped off the face of the earth. And again, he was also involved in the creation of Fort Detrick in 1942, which would be the Center for Biological Warfare, until after 9/11. Because what happened after 9/11, you may remember that anthrax samples turned up in a number of different places. In Congress, Ted Daschle, for some reason, the guy who owned the National Enquirer died of getting anthrax. And it was later determined that the anthrax was the AIM strain that came from Fort Detrick in Maryland. It was part of that biological warfare unit. In 2002, well, first, I should back up. Those samples, once they determined that the samples came from Fort Detrick, in other words, the anthrax was domestic, it came from our biological warfare, the FBI went in and destroyed all of the samples. And then in 2002, they came down with a company called Controlled Demolition Incorporated, and they completely razed the biological warfare. They literally they knocked down the building and pavemented it over. And Controlled Demolition Incorporated would be familiar to anyone who's done any research in the case because they were the same company that cleaned up the World Trade Center towers after 9/11, and they did the same function after the Oklahoma City bomb. So Controlled Demolition pops up everywhere you go.